Good day. My name is Dr. Dawn Drake. I'm Associate Professor of Geography in the Department of Biology in the College of Science and Health at Missouri Western State University. And today I'm going to be talking to you about, can suburbanization be a savior for farms in the U.S.'s dairy death spiral? This research project will pull together several different projects I've been working on over time. It will pull in lived experience, having been on a dairy farm, lived and worked on a dairy farm in eastern Pennsylvania. It'll bring together data, and I'll work through a series of premises hoping to answer this question. As we go through, you will see places where data needs to be updated or additional data could be added. I am aware of that, and I'll be doing that as I move towards this being a chapter in a book that I'm editing about economic geographies of livestock. So the first premise we're going to look at is that U.S. dairy farms are more likely to be in suburbs. And this premise is based out of a model in economic geography called von Thünen's isolated state model. Von Thünen lived in Germany in the late 1800s. And as he looked out on the landscape from his estate, he noticed that there seemed to be a predictable organization of activities on the landscape. And after studying this for some time, he came to this model that you see on the screen here. And I'm not going to go through all of the assumptions and the background to the model, but essentially what you're looking at is based on the notion of a single market, which is why it's called an isolated state model, and how the economic activities of agriculture would organize themselves around that single market based largely on transportation cost and land rents. So we see nearest to the urban center is the market gardening, fruits and vegetables, things that command a very high dollar value to cover what also would be the highest land rents. So as we look at this, we see that the dairy farming ring is in that second ring, and sort of what would be a suburban area. So what are the reasons for dairying in that downtown, or what today is a suburban area? Well, it wasn't so much about land rents. Dairy commands more money, more profit than perhaps grain farming or other livestock ranching would, but it does not command nearly enough profit to cover land rents in a suburb. The reason that dairy farms initially located so close to the urban market in von Thünen's model was because of the lack of refrigeration. In a time period where you needed to milk the cow and get the milk to market, and the milkman needed to distribute it before it spoiled, the farm needed to be close to the market. Even once ice boxes became more well spread, it still was expensive to transport milk. Even in the era of refrigerated train cars and the early refrigerated trucks, it was difficult and expensive to move milk, and milk is heavy. So the dairying stayed close to market. Well, why does it happen today? Why is it still like that today? We can move milk. Milk is still heavy, but we can move milk fairly inexpensively. And we see that in our grocery stores. We have access to our local milk producers here in Missouri, Shadow and others. But we also can access the milk from the Happy Cows in California and other places. We can get milk powder from international locations. So why do dairy farms persist in suburban areas when it would seem that they would have high costs and other challenges? Well, the explanation is often inertia, and in some respects just unwillingness to change, but more commonly that it is too expensive to shift. Everyone could probably find one story of that farmer who sold their farm in the suburbs of upstate New York and sold the herd, sold the 200 acres of land that supported that herd, and then was able to buy 5,000 acres and 3 times as many cows in Montana. And there are stories like that, but they're far and few between. It is difficult to move a dairy operation, and if you're a young person wanting to start up a dairy operation, the barriers to entry are incredibly high. So that is not a common story that we see. Now, anecdotally, growing up in the East Coast of the United States, I knew that this was true, that dairy farms tended to be in suburban areas. But what I set out to do in some of my research was to try and back that quantitatively, to evaluate quantitatively whether von Thünen was still relevant in 21st century United States agriculture. And so to do that, I had 2 sets of data. The first set of data informs the level of rurality or urbanness of a county in the U.S. And this is the USDA Rurality Index. And you can see that it ranks all counties in the United States from 1 to 9 based on their population and their nearness to metro areas. And then along with that, I needed to know where the cows were and how many. And so I pulled the total number of dairy cows and dairy operations from the USDA Census of Agriculture. Census of Agriculture is given every 5 years, so there is a 2017 data set available now that I will be adding to this research before publication, or updating this research before publication. But just to show you the preliminary results that back this premise, we're going to look at the total number of dairy farms, dairy operations in every county in the U.S., and the total head count of dairy cows in each county in the U.S. in 2012. So just to put a map to this, this is looking at total head of dairy cattle in 2012, your standard market areas, your big dairying states, Pennsylvania, New York, Wisconsin, Minnesota, the newcomers, California, Idaho, Arizona, New Mexico. You can see where these cows are. The total herd leader in the United States right now, still in 2020, is Tulare County, California, the one in yellow here. If we looked at total number of operations, it would be Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, over here. So what does that look like when we look at the rurality level? This is showing you total number of dairy cows if we look at the counties at their different rurality codes. And so you can see by far the majority of cows in the U.S. are in rurality code number 2, which is a fairly urban code. You also have high numbers in 3 and 6, and 6 becomes relatively important as well. 6, despite being pretty far down, is actually counties very much like Platte County, Buchanan County, that are themselves metro because of their nearness to another metro area. In the case of Platte County, Buchanan County is metro in its own right, but also is near enough to Kansas City to get some of its influence. If we break this down another way, looking at the total number of counties at each rurality level, the total number of counties that have cows that don't, what percent of those total counties with cows is this? How many head of cattle? Again, we see 2, 3, and 6 rising to the forefront as being important. And so I took this raw data that visually I could see there were some patterns with, and I brought it into statistical analysis, and I did some correlation tests. And what we can see is, regardless of whether I was looking at the number of dairy farms and comparing it to the rurality code, or the number of dairy cows in the rurality code, and whether I ran the analysis with only counties with cows or all counties, in all cases I got a very small but statistically significant negative correlation. And the negative correlation, if the premise is that dairy farms are in urban and suburban areas, that negative correlation is what we would expect, because what that is saying is the lower the rurality code, the higher the number of farms or the higher the number of cows. Okay. So, premise number 2 then that we need to look at is this notion that the U.S. dairy industry is in a sort of a death spiral. And if we look at annual growth of U.S. milk production through time, even if we just look at a small snapshot of 4 years, we can see highs, we can see an increasing trend into the end of 2016, but then we see a steady trend downward with some very massive declines in U.S. milk production in the last 2 years. Now, this drop here, of course, is COVID. We'll talk a little bit about COVID. And while agriculture very much believes that COVID is not a black swan, it is something that we need to address and be vigilant of, this severe drop-off is probably out of the norm for the dairy industry. But this downward trend is what we talk about when we talk about a death spiral. It is not because the number of dairy cows in the United States has declined. The number of dairy cows in the United States between 1999 and 2019 has remained fairly constant. But what has changed is the production per cow. And so basic supply and demand says that as the production per cow has increased, and I will say that this is not primarily because of the use of growth hormones. That is pretty rare in the dairy industry. This is because of selective breeding, dairy farmers paying more attention to the breeding stock, how, when, and with whom they breed their dairy cows, the traits that they get from the bull. We've seen this massive increase in milk production. Basic supply and demand. The supply has increased, the market has been flooded. At the same time, demand has gone down, and we'll talk about why that is in a few minutes. But that has caused the price for milk in the United States to spiral downward. And this declining price for milk has been the real catalyst to the death spiral, to the massive exit of dairy farms that we've seen in this country in the last 5 to 10 years. And while the number of cows in the country does not reflect that, what we would call a death spiral, if you look at the total number of herds and individual farms, which we'll see later, there has been a death spiral. What happens is it's pretty rare to send a dairy herd to slaughter. They go up for auction, another farm absorbs them. But we've seen a steady decline in the number of operations in the U.S. So this is the demand side. Americans are drinking less milk from cows, drinking less dairy milk, despite the positive health benefits that are known to come with dairy milk, and the fact that milk replacements, plant-based milk replacements like soy milk, almond milk, coconut milk, do not provide those same nutritional benefits. This trend starts with concerns about growth hormone and genetically modified organisms being fed to dairy cattle. It continues more recently due to the increase of non-dairy alternatives. The trade war doesn't help the death spiral. As U.S. consumers were continuing to turn away from buying dairy milk, China had changes in its lifestyle, changes in its tastes, that meant it was demanding more dairy milk and more powdered milk that U.S. dairy farmers could have provided, but the trade war prohibited that. Now, one bright spot was the signing of the USMCA that provided some protections and some increased market access for dairy farmers, but the USMCA was signed almost simultaneously with the height of COVID lockdowns in the United States. And so if we look at dairy farmers' self-characterized description of COVID-19 and the impacts on their operation, we see, the majority, 2/3 or greater of farmers, 3/4 of farmers saying it was a moderate to severe effect on their dairy operation. And while what we tend to think of as an average consumer is these signs and the fear of not having access to milk and rationing of milk, for the dairy industry in the US, this was a complete supply chain break and a logistical nightmare, where the dairy farmers were still producing milk. They were milking cows, but for a variety of reasons, there were breaks in the supply chain. That milk couldn't get from the farm to the processing plant to be pasteurized, homogenized, turned into other types of dairy products to get to the store shelves, which is why we saw on the store shelves these rationing signs. Farmers' major markets for that milk, whether it was the grocery store or school, there just simply were sustained breaks in the supply chain. And that led to significant drops in the price of milk. So this is looking at COVID-19's impacts on commodity prices and even future prices. So farmers who thought that they would sell on futures, thinking that the price of milk would come back up. I know there's a lot going on in this graph. You're tracing the gray line here. Saw the price of milk just continue to go down. You can see 36% decline in the price of futures contracts for milk between the first positive case in China on January 14th and the end of March. And so farmers ended up dumping millions of gallons of milk. They just simply had nowhere to go with it. Their processing facilities were closed due to COVID lockdowns or illness in the plant. There were not enough truck drivers to be picking up milk or to get that processed milk to market. Schools, who are a major consumer of dairy milk in this country, and cheese and yogurt, were not in session and therefore were not buying milk products. And probably many of you saw wonderful, uplifting stories on the internet of the farmer that was going to have to dump all their milk and sell their cows, and the neighbors came out and bought the milk at the farm gate, which is uplifting, is amazing. Having lived on a dairy farm, not surprising that the neighbors would come help out, but also illegal in almost every state in the United States to buy raw milk without a license. And we'll talk a little bit more about raw milk later. There were stories about food pantries, farmers giving product to food pantries. Well, yes, again, it has to be pasteurized and homogenized first. And that step was simply broken. And so in this death spiral, looking at the bigger picture, not just at COVID, you can see in this figure from 2003 to 2019, it's fluctuated from year to year how many dairy herds we've lost in any given year. But you can see in 2019, the largest loss at 9%, and that's continuing downward. And we could look more at this trend. My research doesn't look at this trend because there's another chapter in the book I'm working on that focuses very much on Wisconsin. But Wisconsin has seen 25 to 30% of its dairy herds leave the state in the last 5 years. So it's a serious concern. And I'll finish this premise with this graphic. I found this graphic. I just thought it was kind of powerful. They're showing you starting in 1970 going to 2018 how many dairy farms have been lost in the United States. So that's the second premise. We have premise one: dairy farms are typically located in suburbs in the U.S. Premise two: the U.S. dairy industry is in a death spiral of sorts. Premise three: suburbs can stop the death spiral. Now here, we're going to pull in some of my research and my anecdotal evidence, looking at two case studies from farms that I'm very familiar with in eastern Pennsylvania. Does eastern Pennsylvania represent all suburbs in the United States? Absolutely not. Is eastern Pennsylvania, right in the center of megalopolis, indicative of what's likely to happen in many of these suburbs? Probably. Okay. So, and when I talk about suburbs, I'm going to specifically focus on something that I call the rural-urban fringe. So what is the rural-urban fringe? Well, the rural-urban fringe, those words probably individually mean things to you, right? Rural, urban, suburban. There are different classifications. As we look at this image, we could write rural or urban on here. But I think all of us know, and from driving around here or wherever, that what's in the middle here, what we can't see, is not a stark transition where we go from a house to a cow, but a transition zone where you have mixing. And that's what the rural-urban fringe is. It's an area that was traditionally rural that urban and suburban land uses are starting to encroach upon and force out the rural land uses. And this happens for a variety of reasons in the US, with pressures that come from both the urban side and the rural side. So on the urban side, you have urban areas that are growing. The percentage of Americans that live in urban areas has increased steadily. It crossed the 50% threshold. More than half of Americans lived in urban areas as of the 1920 census. Today, and when we get the 2020 census, 100 years later, it is going to be somewhere in the 85 to 90% of Americans live in an urban area. So those urban populations are growing. The urban areas are sprawling. Urban areas do go up, but they also go out, and they generally go out faster than they go up. And so as the urban areas encroach on the rural areas, you start to have competitions between land uses. That same open space that grows corn and wheat and soybeans and is grazing area for livestock is also space for warehouses, housing developments, big box stores. And you start getting intermixing, and you have issues between the stakeholders. And I'm going to talk about some of those challenges and issues a little bit later. But very often when you have that, what you see is that the farmers are the ones who give, for a variety of reasons that vary from just sheer economic reasons and the amount of money they're offered for their land, to just not wanting to continue to deal with the issues. And so we see conversion of farmland to other uses. From the rural side, you have factors driving this as well. We have a decline in agricultural acreage in this country. We are losing farms. It is not always because somebody offered you a lot of money to convert that farmland into a strip mall. It is sometimes simply because our farmers are aging. The next generation is not going into farming. Every state in the US has lost agricultural acreage in the last 20 years, and not all of that is because of suburbanization. At the same time, we don't need as many farmers. We have fewer farmers managing larger tracts of land in this country because of mechanization, because of autonomous operations that allow farmers to be more efficient, because of scientific inputs and advancements that allow farmers to produce more food on the same amount of land. And so you have this declining workforce, you have this declining acreage, you're seeing the consolidation of family farms as the next generation maybe doesn't want to farm or can't decide how to split the land. And so all of that is allowing for this conversion in the rural-urban fringe. And so this is a pretty common graphic to see, talking about that efficiency of the US farmer. America's farmer feeds about 155 people worldwide today. In 1960, that same farmer would have only fed about 26 people. Grain yields are up. A single farmer can manage more acres, so my family farms, depending on the year, between 1,000 and 1,500 acres. It is only my brother-in-law and my nephew that do that for the most part, because we have big pieces of machinery and we can use autonomy and other things. So in this landscape, in this rural-urban fringe, you're going to have both challenges and opportunities, both for the farmers and for the new residents. I'm going to just focus on the farmers here because these challenges and opportunities sound similar between the two groups. And we're focusing here on this notion that the opportunities can overcome the challenges for dairy farmers, at least. So the challenges here, and I'm gonna be a little vague here, and then I'm gonna get into two case studies, and I'll give you some specific examples. But incompatible land uses, Big $500,000 homes next to livestock operations are not necessarily a good mix. Neighbors who, when I'm being less generous, I call them stupid human tricks, complain about the everyday realities of a farm: odor, noise, lights, truck traffic. And honestly, it's not stupid human tricks. They don't know better. Okay? But the farmer then faces lawsuits for odor abatement, noise abatement. Every state in the United States has some version of a Right to Farm Act that protects those farmers from those nuisance lawsuits, but they still have to go to court to have them thrown out. That's lost time and money. And perhaps the biggest challenge for these farmers, and especially for the dairy farmers, is going to be based on that simple supply and demand metric. That as the demand for land between the different groups, between the sprawling urban areas and the existing farmers, as that demand increases and the supply does not, or in fact the supply starts to dwindle as land is developed, the price for land is going to steadily increase, and farmers who are renting land, because especially in the East Coast of the U.S., a lot of farmers don't own all of their land. We only own about 200 to 300 acres of the land that we farm. We rent the rest of it. Those rents are going to go up, and taxes go up. Those new residents want services. They want ambulance, they want fire, they want sidewalks, schools, snow plows, and so taxes go up. But at the same time, there's opportunities that come with those new residents, with that expanding urban area. Those people who are moving into these rural urban fringe areas are doing so because they want the experience of being their own little lord of the estate. They want to be their own little hobby farmer, maybe. They want the green grass. They want to go out in their John Deere tractor and spend all day mowing the grass. They want to know where their food comes from. They want to know what their food's name is, or at least that's what they say. They don't really want to know that, but they are new customers. They represent increased sales opportunities for the farmer to maybe recover some of those rising costs. Now, this isn't probably going to be sale in your existing operations. It's going to require change and pivot to high value crops, shifting to, instead of traditional corn, soybeans, wheat, hay, although hay could be a high value crop, fruits and vegetables, ornamentals and nursery crops, different wine grapes, hops for brewing, moving towards kind of the craft brewery, winery, distillery path, niche production that commands a higher value, such as organics, or in the case for dairy farmers, depending on the state and the law, raw milk production. So raw milk is basically directly out of the cow. It's not pasteurized or homogenized yet. It has a number of health benefits, especially for people who have milk allergies or lactose intolerance. And it commands a higher value, and we'll talk a little bit more about how much higher value. Added on top of all of that, if you have the ability to open your farm to agritourism, to invite people in to meet the cows, to feed the cows, to go to the petting zoo, to go for a hayride, a corn maze, whatever it is, that's adding more value on top. And so for this premise, I'm going to present two case studies to you from the same county in eastern Pennsylvania, Northampton County. I'll show it to you on a map here in a moment. The first case study is going to highlight a lot of the challenges that come with being in the rural-urban fringe. And then the second will focus more on the opportunities. So the first is Farview Farmstead Farm. And in the interest of full disclosure, this is a farm that I lived on for some time. When I came to the farm, I'm sorry, let's start with the map. I promised you to tell you where Northampton County was. So eastern Pennsylvania, right on the border area here, it's almost entirely red, so high quality farmland, high development, is in the commuting zone in New York City, so door to door without traffic, about an hour you could be in Manhattan from Northampton County. This whole entire eastern part of Pennsylvania down to Northampton County is part of the commuting zone to New York City that has developed since the late 1980s. In the northern part, that is a shift from outdoor land, tourism, hiking, boating kind of land uses to housing. In Monroe, southern Monroe and Northampton County, Monroe County is where I was born and raised, it's a conversion of farmland to rural, or to this, in this rural urban fringe area. So this picture is taken from the top of our grain bin. My nephew took it. It's a little blurry because it was raining the day he took it. This is looking at just a small portion of our farm, but when I came to the farm, we were farming about 400 or 500 acres to support a dairy herd of about 50 cattle. But we're struggling with that. These houses that you see here were starting to be built. My brother-in-law to this day jokes, although I suspect it's a laugh so you don't cry kind of joke, that our farmland grows houses better than it grows crops. So we have houses on all three sides of this farm. If my nephew would have spun around and shown you behind him, you would see warehouses on the U, on the three sides of the U on the other side of the farm. And so this was a challenge. Those new neighbors didn't understand that dairy cows are going to holler in the middle of the night if they're hungry. That cows smell. Dairy cows don't smell because they get washed at least twice a day, but the steers and the calves smelled. That the milk truck came at 3 a.m. on some days. That some days there was mud in the road from the tractors. Perhaps the most challenging thing that, in some cases I'm sympathetic to the homeowners, but you can sort of see in the background of this picture, along our dairy pasture, there was a creek. There is a creek. And the cows would go down there in the middle of the night to get water, especially if there was no water left in their trough or they were just looking for a cool place to be. And then they would come back in the morning. Well, when they built the houses, they built a bike trail along the creek. Now, dairy cows are relatively smart, although are relatively smart as creatures of habit. They can learn behavior and replicate it. Well, so these cows go walking down to the creek to get their drink at night, and they see this trail, and they sort of become disoriented. Is this the trail they followed to get down here? And they wander along the bike trail. And inevitably, in the middle of the night, my brother-in-law would get a phone call that there were cows in the housing development. Now, he always would respond, well, they're going to come back in the morning. They're going to want to be milked and fed. The neighbors were less sympathetic to that. They didn't really believe that. But these challenges, coupled with that death spiral in the price of milk, coupled with the fact that he really was concerned that his daughters would feel that they had to stay on the farm, led us to make a decision in 2005. We sold the herd and switched to a grain farm, which is at the point where the farm went to the 1,000 to 1,500 acres. Now, that is not without its set of challenges as well with these neighbors. That's a whole nother presentation that I can get into. It's a different aspect of my research, but there are challenges that come with neighbors with a grain farm as well. The second case study I want to look at is Klein Farms, also in Northampton County, about less than 5 miles away from Farview Farmstead. And to prove that my brother-in-law probably shouldn't have worried about whether his daughters were going to want to stay on the farm or feel they had to stay on the farm, my niece married a dairy farmer, and so this is her in-laws farm. Klein Farms is a different sort of story. So in the late 80s, early 1990s, Klein Farms had a illness go through the barn. Very many sick cows were not producing well. They were forced to cull the herd and leave the dairy industry, essentially. And they had a choice to make. They could just simply exit the dairy industry. They could go to grain farming. They could pursue something else. They could buy new cows and start over in the model that they were in at a time when this Northampton County was just really starting to see the influx of city dwellers and the growth of big box stores and that rural urban fringe phenomenon. Or they could think outside the box. And so they chose to think outside the box and really go towards that niche production, high value, cover their costs. At the time in the early 1990s, raw milk licenses were available in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, but were not very widespread. The majority of them were held for goat's milk, not cow's milk, and the majority of permits for cow's milk were held by the Amish in southeastern Pennsylvania. But Klein's decided that they were going to pursue a raw milk permit and a raw milk cheese permit, so permitted to make and sell cheese from raw milk and not having to pasteurize the milk first. And that started a trend, or started a new business. And they opened with just this little tiny dairy store doing raw milk and raw milk cheese. And they invited people in to pet the animals, to meet the animals. So this is my niece's husband many years ago. You could come in and look in the peek in the cheese room, or where they make the cheese. They were doing some baked goods. But this was a way to flip that narrative. So I said one of the reasons that Farview Farmstead left the dairy industry was the low price of milk. Well, we were getting about $13 a hundredweight for milk from the wholesaler when we left the industry. That works out to about $1 a gallon. At that same time, Klein's was selling raw milk for over $4 a gallon. Today they sell it for over $6 a gallon. Okay? It's a niche market. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is the only state on the eastern, so of all the states that touch eastern Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, New York, Pennsylvania is the only one where it is legal to sell raw milk direct to the consumer without a lot of extra hoop jumping. So in New York, it's legal, but you have to have a prescription from your doctor, so it makes it much more difficult. And so Klein Farms sees a lot of people coming in on a Saturday morning, people coming in buying 20 or 30 gallons of milk and taking it home. Milk will freeze, and raw milk is especially easy to freeze because the major thing that can happen when you freeze milk is that it will separate into its constituent parts. Well, if the milk isn't homogenized to begin with, it's already separated. So it doesn't matter if you freeze it. Okay. So that grew, that little idea kept growing. Raw milk, cheese, yogurt, cheese spreads, local beef and eggs, fruits and vegetables, flowers, baked goods, farm to fork dinners, hay rides, petting zoo, all kinds of different things. And then about 2 years ago, they were approached by someone who said, we want to start buying a certain amount of your milk, X amount of milk every week, because we want to make ice cream and sell it, and we're going to tell people it's your milk. And so Klein said, well, why don't you come make the ice cream here? And so they opened up a new store that includes the Happy Holstein ice cream shop a few years ago. All right, so in this premise then, we see, okay, yeah, there's challenges, but there are opportunities to overcome the death spiral. But the question that probably many of you are asking is that a one-off case, or is it sustainable? Is it possible? And the answer is, it's not going to be possible for everybody. The suburbs can stop the death spiral for some dairy farms. Okay? Part of it is because competition is going to drive out some dairy farms and reduce the number of cows, reduce the milk production, which will help the price of the milk. But the other thing is that some farms are going to be able to do what Klein's did. Some farms are going to do what Farview Farmstead did, but some farms are going to be able to do what Klein's did. Is this sustainable in the long run? Is this going to solve the U.S.'s dairy problems? Probably not. So this is a chart that comes from Hoard's Dairyman, which is kind of the industry standard publication. This was published a few years ago in an article about basically about the U.S. dairy death spiral. And what they were saying at the time was there's going to be some declines. Is it going to be, worst case scenario, a 4% decline, or is it going to be less? Is it going to be more like 3.25%? And this is just projecting how many cows are left in the U.S., or I'm sorry, how many operations are left in the U.S. in those different scenarios. So the industry accepts that there's going to be losses, right? And what we've seen since the 1990s is a steady march of the dairy industry from the East Coast, from these places where the rural urban fringe pressures are much more pressing, to the West. Okay, and so if you look at this map, how you read this map, the dark green areas are areas that have seen the largest increase in milk production over the area. The red areas are declines. And so what you see is you do see increases in traditional dairy states in certain areas. Much of that is going to, because this is looking at pounds of milk, is going to be about breeding, is not about herd numbers. This, California, Idaho, New Mexico, this little bit in Arizona, that is very much about brand new herds coming into the area. And so this is showing you the geographic center of the dairy industry in the US from 1960 to 2010 has marched steadily westward. Here's the problem with this. If you look at these areas over here with the greens for the new herds, the places where people move to escape the rural urban fringe, they are also the places that have the most climate change concerns. And so this graphic came from an article in the Journal of Dairy Science a few years ago, about a year ago, they asked a group of prominent dairy scientists, what are the biggest challenges you see for the US dairy industry? And they identified climate change. And so these numbers in these bubbles is the percent of the dairy herd in the US per state. So 20% of the US dairy herd, as represented in California, is going to need to move eastward because of water shortages created by climate change. They're not going to be able to water the cows, they're not going to be able to feed the cows, or they're not going to be able to have enough water to keep operations clean. And so you see that for California, for Arizona, for New Mexico, for Texas, for Kansas, for Colorado, and for Idaho. Okay. So what does this mean for the future of the dairy industry? Well, I'd love to have a fourth premise that actually could answer that. Can suburbs be the savior for the US dairy death spiral? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. Climate change and how climate change proceeds is going to be a very big part of this. If climate change forces milk production downward, dairy cows produce less under heat stress. Maybe this solves itself and it's not about suburbs, but the notion of the sophisticated, I shouldn't say sophisticated, but the consumer on the East Coast or the West Coast or any rural urban fringe area who wants to have that authentic sort of buy from the producer experience, those areas are going to be where you have a dairy farm that saves itself. Okay, so I'd love questions or feedback. Feel free to provide those to me in the Q&A or email me. I'd love to chat. And you need to acknowledge my study partners, so the Farview Farmstead, Gary Melissa Fainall and family, Jake and Amanda Klein and Klein Farms, and also my funding support from the College of Science and Health and from the biology department and my colleagues in the biology department, and also the Department of Social Sciences and Humanities who have supported my research over the years. Thank you.